Thank you very much. I want to thank the Palestine Center, and I want to thank Yusuf Munayr for having us. Now, this is sort of, I should start, I suppose, I feel I should start by saying, my name is Amjad Atallah, and I'm a recovering peace processor. The title of the talk actually has given me, gave me a way to go forward in the talk because of the word déjà vu. But first I just want to say how honored I am, first of all, to be on a panel with Dr. Maksoud, who was always an inspiration to me even as a young man, and was actually a professor of mine in law school. And so it's wonderful to be, usually I was sitting on that side and he was sitting on this side lecturing to us. It's wonderful and an honor to be on a panel with him. I also actually remember studying all of your research, Dr. Ibrahim, so it's a great honor to also be here with you. So the word déjà vu that was in the title reminded me of the Bill Murray movie, Groundhog Day. Now, for those of you who've seen it, I love Bill Murray, and I think Groundhog Day is one of his best works, but for those of you who've seen the movie, Bill Murray finds himself in this horrible situation where he wakes up and has the same day over and over and over again. And no matter what he does, he can't actually change the day. And he becomes so despondent, so desperate that he isn't able to get to the next day that he begins to kill himself. So every day he wakes up and tries to think of some creative way to kill himself that day, hoping that that'll end it, but then he wakes up in the morning again and has to start the process all over again. The Israelis, the Palestinians, and the Arab states, and those are the parties I'm going to talk about briefly, are stuck in Groundhog Day. They're stuck waking up every single day and reliving the same mistakes that they made the day before, and reliving the same policies that they enacted the day before, and then going to bed wondering why the outcome hasn't been any different. I'm assuming, as I talk about the three parties, that everybody's a rational actor, including actually the Israelis, who I won't talk about. Everyone is a rational actor, so everyone is acting according to a specific set of interests that are being addressed. Now, I want to start with the United States, because that's where it's most obvious that there's this inability to break out of the cycle. The United States has had a policy from the very beginning that in order to best accommodate American national interests, and then later that transformed into best accommodating Israeli existential interests, the best that the United States could do was to try to negotiate an end to the Israeli-Arab conflict. This meant that, in fact, for the United States, it wasn't a question of rights, or it wasn't a question of Palestinian rights. It still isn't really a question of Palestinian rights. It's a question of Israeli interests and American interests. So to the extent that the United States has wanted to defend those interests, it has needed to find the lowest common denominator point where it thinks the Arabs can accept a peace and therefore accommodate American interests. So the United States isn't religious on this issue. They're not worried about whether Palestinian refugees have a right of return. They're not concerned specifically about how Jerusalem is shared. They're not specifically concerned whether there are Israeli troops in the Jordan Valley or not. They're just concerned that Israel can accept, that Israel want the plan, and that the Arabs are able to be forced to accept the plan. And that's the magic spot that the United States has been looking for now over 20 years. What's amazing is that this sounds like it's so pro-Israeli, this position, that you would think, why would it take 20 years for the United States and Israel together to figure out how to actually implement a policy that is based and conditioned on what Israel desires in the first place? And that's what the United States can't figure out. The United States can't figure it out because it's assuming it's acting in Israel's best interest. And it can't understand, therefore, why every accommodation it's made towards Israel hasn't resulted in an agreement. Now, the United States has tried a number of different things. It's tried tough love, and it's tried unadulterated agapeic love, unconditional love. So it's tried both kinds of love. And so far, both kinds of love haven't necessarily accommodated the U.S. interest in ending the conflict. Currently, the United States seems to be in a process of negotiating with Israel, and the negotiations seem to be based on the idea, what haven't I given you yet that you still want? Because the United States has already begun negotiating Palestinian permanent status issues with the Israelis. Not the United States has the right to, of course, sell Israel every weapon in the U.S. arsenal if it wishes. That's a U.S. sovereign decision. But the United States isn't just negotiating about giving away U.S. stuff to Israel. They're also negotiating about giving away Palestinian stuff to Israel. So they're negotiating the Jordan Valley, whether Israeli troops would be able to stay in the Jordan Valley forever or 3 generations, which is forever for all practical purposes, whether Israel would be able to keep East Jerusalem, whether it would be able to lease it, whether if Israel could continue building settlements at a slower pace for just a few more months, then the United States will promise that under no circumstances in the future will it ever ask Israel to not build settlements again. The policies are actually so... This is the first time I remember agreeing with Elliot Abrams. They smack of desperation. And it reminded me of Bill Murray in the middle of the movie, where he was really desperate to try to break out of it and was trying to do anything and everything that he could think of without actually changing his own behavior. He was trying to figure out how he could actually get out of this process. Now, for the Palestinians, actually, now normally I would have actually, in this audience, and I always actually use my addresses at the Palestine Center to be the most critical of Palestinian actions and Palestinian decision-making, primarily because I assume you're primarily a pro-Palestinian. You've already agreed with Palestinian rights. I don't need to convince you of that part. And so I often use this part to criticize the Palestinians the most. The truth of the matter is I think the Palestinians are actually much further along than they've ever been in terms of recognizing that they're trapped in this movie. There is no Palestinian negotiator, there is no Palestinian leader that I know of that doesn't recognize that they're stuck, that they're trapped, that the negotiation process that's been articulated and that's been designed is actually designed to end with their failure. Because they recognize that what's being negotiated isn't an end to the occupation. What's being negotiated isn't Palestinian freedom. So far what's being negotiated is how to repackage the occupation. And there's no Palestinian leader who wants that, regardless of what you may think about them. But even more to the point, there's no Palestinian leader that could survive accepting such a thing. And so therefore, the United States is missing a cue right now because it doesn't recognize that the things it's talking about to the Israelis are specifically talking to them about them because they know there's no way the Palestinians can ever accept them. It's not that the Israelis are being unreasonable. The Israelis know that the Palestinians can't accept these deals. They need to get the United States to adopt those positions because then the Palestinians will be in a position of never being able to accept a two-state agreement. According to Dr. Ibrahim said that there's a conventional wisdom as to what that might look like. Well, that conventional wisdom, I would argue, is almost dead. It's almost dead because it's not that the Palestinians refuse to accept it. It's almost dead because the Israelis never accepted the compromise of giving up 22% of what they consider to be the land of Israel, to flip the argument from the historic Palestine. They never accepted that they were going to have to give up the 22%. So the Palestinians have accepted that they can't go this route. And for the first time, you had President Abbas, when he was addressing the Arab League, actually tell them negotiations may not work, and we're going to have to consider other options. And he laid out 4 potential options, which he didn't flesh out or explain in any detail. But those 4 options were that we may have to ask the United States, we collectively may have to ask the United States to accept a Palestinian state or recognize it within the 67 borders. Or we may have to get international institutions, including the UN, to recognize a Palestinian state within 67 borders. Or we may have to resort to a trusteeship / mandate system again. Or we may have to shut down the PA. Now, for President Abbas to actually lay out those options to an Arab League audience, even in a private address, is, but subsequently leaked, of course, to the media, to me is reflective that the Palestinians recognize that they're trapped in this thing. But what are the policies the Palestinians are engaged in that they haven't necessarily changed? Well, there's still a ceasefire, for example. Palestinians, both the West Bank and the Gaza Strip, regardless of what you think, again, of Hamas or Fatah or the PA, they're all maintaining a ceasefire with Israel. There's a quid pro quo. Israel is not trying to dismantle the governing infrastructure of Hamas or of the PA, and the PA and Hamas are not engaged. And they're also working hard to prevent spoilers from attacking Israel from within their territory, but not from within the other side's territory. So Hamas is interested in preventing people from funding people inside Gaza to attack Israel from Gaza, and the PA is desperately working to prevent people who are being funded maybe from outside as well, inside the West Bank, from using the West Bank as a platform to attack Israel. And I don't necessarily I think that as long I'm against attacks on civilians under any conditions and under any circumstances, regardless of by which side. So I think that this is in fact a good move on the Palestinian side. The problem is that at the same time there's no countervailing pressure on Israel to end the occupation. And so what countervailing pressures could there be? Well, the non-resistance movement that you heard about in, I think, in the first panel or the second panel. I was actually watching it online because I couldn't get here for it. The BDS movement, the nonviolent civil disobedience, all of these things actually are impacting Israel. But the PA isn't necessarily involved, neither is Hamas, specifically in these efforts in a very large way or at the level of national leadership. There isn't also an attempt to attack the occupation in international legal forums as adamantly as they could, as we've seen by some of the attempts to pull back on the Goldstone report, as we've seen by other attempts to, and that's because of pressure from other parties, no doubt, but nevertheless, it also means that there's no pressure on the Israeli side. So in that respect, nothing's changed. Now on the Arab state side, in a way they're worse off than the US or the Palestinians, because the US and the Palestinians recognize they're Bill Murray in the movie. They recognize that they're the actor who's waking up and seeing that everything's changed. The Arab leaders are the ones waking up every morning and finding out that they're the bit players in the movie who are doing exactly the same thing over and over again, but aren't actually even the main player able to make a difference. They're only responding to changes that the main players make in their activities. Now, there's no reason for that. There's nothing constraining. There's no rational reason to constrain the governments from acting differently, except maybe inertia and lack of momentum. And I'll give you an example specifically. So every Arab government right now is very irritated with the United States because of the process that the United States has been going forward in, and because they're terrified that this is going to actually impact them negatively. And they've based their alliances with the United States, and maybe I'll disagree a little bit with an angle of what Dr. Ibrahim said. I mean, they may not want to end the conflict. The idea that they want to keep the conflict going at a low simmer, maybe some of them do, not all of them do. And if you're basing your legitimacy on your relationship with the United States, you need the United States to be the good guy. And if the United States isn't the good guy to anybody in your country, that's destabilizing to you. So there is a desire for the United States to play a positive role. But they don't know how to suggest this. They don't know how to influence this. They don't know how to. So, for example, it is an election year, and there is, not surprisingly, a large arms sale deal that's been made between an Arab nation and between the United States. Usually there's either an arms sale or a trade deal or something that's done. It's almost like when you go to somebody's house, you go with flowers. And so this happens every election cycle. But there's this constant, I've come to your house with flowers, and I just don't understand why you're not doing anything differently. And the point of it, of course, is that what we've done, now there's some countries, I know that some people might be able to pull out specific examples. Qatar has a very active foreign policy department right now that's operating, probably doing more in foreign policy than all Arab countries combined, but still paling in comparison, say, for example, to Turkey. And but on the Palestinian issue, the Arab governments, for example, even when President Abbas wanted them to tell him, don't go back to negotiations, under pressure from the United States, and then they went ahead and said, no, it's up to you. If you want to do it, you can do it. And which put the pressure entirely back in his corner, where he did not want it. So, but then they complain about the United States. Why is the United States forcing them into negotiations? And so this paradox means that what we've ended up with is a cycle of unconditional incentives. Everybody is offering an incentive to somebody else, which ultimately results in Israel having every incentive to maintain the occupation. Benjamin Netanyahu is perfectly rational. His government is perfectly rational. They're doing what's in their best interest. And if the Arabs and the United States are providing you with everything that you could possibly need to maintain the occupation, why wouldn't you? It's unfair to ask Netanyahu, under these circumstances, to stand up to his right-wing coalition and say we should do something differently. I mean, from his own perspective, from his own interest. Why would he do it differently? Israel's become like a king in ancient times. It's at the end of the rainbow. So people are coming from all over and offering gifts at the floor of the king and suggesting, I hope things work out. Here's a gift. Here's the OECD. Here's the OECD membership. Here are arms sales. We'll adopt your position on leasing. We'll adopt your position on the Jordan Valley. We will. Really, you still won't give up any territory? and the gifts keep coming. And as long as the gifts keep coming, in my opinion, Israel will keep on accepting the gifts, but it won't actually act any differently than it has. So, since we're the last panel, I hate to be negative. I want to end with recommendations. My recommendations. Each party should do what Bill Murray did. At the end of the day, they have to change the behavior that they have the most influence over. Palestinians do not have the most influence over Israeli behavior, or American behavior, or Arab behavior. They have the most influence over Palestinian behavior. The United States has the most influence not over Israeli behavior, we know that. It has the most influence over American behavior. We can make decisions as Americans for the United States. Palestinians can make decisions for Palestine as Palestinians. Arabs can make decisions for their own states as leaders of those Arab states. So what would be those decisions that you would take that would get you to the goal that you've stated you want to get to? For Bill Murray, it was to get to day 2. He just wanted to get to that next day. What is it that you would do to get to the next day? A day that's after conflict, a day in which Palestinians are free, a day in which Israel is accepted in the region. How do you get to that day? For the United States, I think it means right now taking a time out before you give away anything else and conduct a review of U.S. actions and their results. Just have a sheet, a spreadsheet, and say, when we do this, Israel does that. Oh, I see now. But we have to have this list. We have to have this list. What are our actions? What are Israel's corresponding actions? And then what are the political, military, and diplomatic steps we can take not to isolate Israel, because Israel is the United States' ally. We will always be committed to Israel more than we will be committed to any state in the region. What are the actions we can take to divorce U.S. policy from the occupation? We can love Israel. We can hug Israel, and we can give Israel every weapon we have. But we can also divorce ourselves from the occupation simultaneously. And there are a number of different steps that the United States can do to do that. Now, for the Palestinians, and as American citizens, by the way, for all of us who are American citizens, I think in terms of our own actions and advocacy, I think that this gives us a direction to work in. For Palestinians, I think there are 3 steps. One, the reunification of a Palestinian national movement, or the recreation of a Palestinian national movement. No matter how many ways you slice it, if the Palestinians aren't unified, they're not effective. When they're unified, they can be a little bit more effective, but not necessarily entirely effective. When the PLO had every group under the sun underneath its umbrella, and it made decisions by consensus, it meant it didn't make decisions most of the time. And each of the groups underneath it would do whatever they wanted individually. So I'm not suggesting that this is a panacea, that this will solve everything. But there is a crisis of legitimacy among Palestinians. And that crisis of legitimacy has been used by the Israelis as one excuse for not ending the occupation. For Palestinians' own purposes, they would benefit from trying to recreate a Palestinian national movement. 2, they need to pursue support for an international nonviolence resistance campaign. Now, I said international. I mean, the work that's being done in the occupied territory is very brave, and it's amazing, and it's important. but it needs to be done internationally as well. It needs to happen in European capitals, and it needs to happen in the United States. People don't notice what's happening in Budrus until there's a demonstration that's connected to it in New York or in Washington or Chicago or Los Angeles that's connected directly to it on the same day at the same time, to remind people that this is an international effort to free Palestinians, not the effort of a local community group in a village that's surrounded by a wall. And bring it back to the question of Palestinian freedom. And the Palestinian leadership can play a large role in promoting that kind of effort across the international community. And simultaneously have an international diplomatic campaign for recognition of Palestinian rights, including 67 borders. Now, for the Arabs, they can actually also play roles that don't require anybody else's approval. They can support Palestinian reunification. Palestinian Arab governments have sort of divided. They either support Ramallah or they support Gaza. Okay, if the Arab governments all decided they don't support either Ramallah or Gaza, but they're going to support one government, one Palestinian government, it's going to put heavy pressure, and it changes the dynamics between both Gaza and Ramallah, which at the moment aren't under any strong pressure to reunite. They can also provide financial assistance to the Palestinian national movement. Regardless of how you look at it, the Palestinian national movement has always been rich. It's been rich either because it received money from Arab states and from Palestinians in the diaspora, or it was rich because it then became the Palestinian Authority and accepted money from the European Union and from Arab states. And that patronage system has been very, very difficult to break. And in fact, I personally don't know any system where you can ask people to divest themselves from an entitlement, to use an earlier word. And that entitlement is all the money that's been coming in. One of the reasons there's no Palestinian national movement outside of the PA is because the money is going into the PA. So if there was a Palestinian national movement that was also funded, whether by the diaspora, whether by Arab states, by whatever source, it would actually provide another center of gravity for activity. And the Arab governments can support an international nonviolence component, resistance component, and a diplomatic campaign for recognizing. But basically what you're trying to do is shift incentives. You need to shift the incentives that these countries, and the Arab countries can also, they provide incentives to the United States to maintain the current system also. They can shift those incentives. When a European country or another country supports Palestinian borders, for example, on the 67 borders, or when they support a flotilla, instead of being embarrassed or being angry with Turkey or with another country for actually standing up on behalf of Palestinian rights, you're better off joining them. You're better off actually being on their side rather than being humiliated that Turkey and Iran and other countries are able to advocate for Palestinian rights better than you can. Now, I'll end here by saying the best thing I think we can do is if each of us determines for ourselves individually, and if we determine for our countries as citizens of whatever country we belong to, what steps do we need to take personally in order to make tomorrow possible? And what changes are we going to have to do? Because obviously what we've been doing hasn't been working. Thank you.
This is one time I would like to say to my former student, keep talking. It just goes to show that the Arabic saying, how many students have way superseded their teachers, this is a living proof. I would like to introduce myself as probably the living dinosaur of the Arab world. I want to disclose my deficits before I speak about my assets. I am irreconcilable an Arab nationalist, and I don't think there is any delivery of Palestinian rights except through a moment of Arab Renaissance and unity. Having disclosed my unrealistic approach, I will now try to build up some of the views that I entertain. The second observation I would like to make is that I do not accept or acquiesce the dominant narrative pertaining to the Palestinian cause. I don't accept that the Palestinian Authority is, quote, negotiating. Because negotiations is not a fishing trip to discover whether you have rights. Negotiations is when you and your negotiating partner agree on the outcome and you negotiate the steps, the conditions, the timetable. You don't negotiate to discover whether you have the rights. Negotiations in this case also is not feasible, although it is commonly used, because there is no basis in legal terms for a negotiating process. You might call it peace process, but not a negotiating process. Because Israel never, since 1967 and even before, but let's go to 67 to restore a little bit of my reputation as a realist. Since 1967, we're discussing now since 1967. Israel has never acknowledged that it is an occupying power. Since June 5th, 1967, it has never acknowledged that it is an occupying power. Ladies and gentlemen, what is it then in the West Bank, Gaza, and East Jerusalem? Now here is the semantical acrobacy of Israel, and particularly somebody I was sort of associated with as a so-called partner during the Security Council, the master of semantical acrobacy, Mr. Benjamin Netanyahu. Let me explain. What is the status of Israel in the West Bank and Gaza and East Jerusalem? Occupier? If it was an occupation, then negotiations would be the approach that should be taken, because that presumes that there has been an agreement that the two-state system within the borders of 1967 has been agreed upon, and therefore you negotiate the process, the steps, the conditions, etc. I don't think anybody believes that that is the position of all the governments, and more particularly, and a much more open way, of the present government. Then, what is it? What is? Now, naturally, the imperative that Israel has established is that it seeks security amongst belligerent atmosphere and context. Belligerent. So, security. So, what, as Amjad has just said, the United States is concerned about Israeli interest, namely security, and not about Palestinian rights. This equation is absolutely a definition of the peace process, particularly since Oslo. Let me examine what are the options to determine what are the Israelis in the West Bank and Gaza and East Jerusalem. Well, they have already defined Gaza. Now, they have lots of definitions for all of these elements, these geographic elements of what constitutes the future Palestinian state, if that ever takes place. What is the status of Gaza? Occupied? No. It is an belligerent entity. Enemy entity, some of them say it, but let us say it's a belligerent entity. That means it's an enemy territory. Okay. That gives Israel the right to strike it at will, as it has done, and therefore it is amenable to being usurped, attacked, without any inhibition or constraint. Now, what about West Bank? Of course, there's 2-3 categories, but basically, what is the definition of the legal status of Israel in the occupied territories? It is sui generis. Now, for those who don't know Latin very well, it means it's a peculiar status. It's a unique status. It is I'm talking from the Webster dictionary. It's, on the one hand, it is a sui generis is a constituency, a class of its own, a class of its own. It is also a unique category, peculiar category. These are deliberate words to avoid classification and legal definition. Right? Am I wrong? Right. Okay. I mean, now, if this is the situation, why does the Palestinian Authority keep saying we negotiate? Now, how does this manifest itself when you don't have the clarity of the equation between a negotiator and an occupation? What is it? Now, if these are, one is a belligerent entity because of Hamas, one is unique status, which means you're avoiding definition, then East Jerusalem, that, you don't talk about that. East Jerusalem, with the more few Israelis might say, well, let's give it to them. But with the present government, earlier governments, East Jerusalem is part of the eternal and perennial. They're always the two together. Don't forget. It's the perennial, which means 3,000 years ago, and the permanent. And the permanent capital of Israel. So we have the categories of sui generis in the West Bank. We have the entity in Palestine, in Gaza Strip, which is enemy territory, belligerent territory. And we have the East Jerusalem, which is supposed to be foregone conclusion. Then what is the PLO negotiating? This is the case. This is the problematic. Now, of course, you get the arguments. The people of Palestine are exasperated. They're tired. They just want to exist. They just want to survive. We have thousands and thousands of prisoners. We will try and plead for their case on humanitarian basis. The European Union is so graceful and generous so that they allow the so-called infrastructure in the West Bank to be viable and serviceable to the people with generous investments. Now, what is being said, look at the new situation in Ramallah and in other places. We have development, we have infrastructure, but we also have, and they won't say that, we also have security forces trained in Jordan and under the guidance of an American general who knows how to train security forces, who have been drawn for what was supposed to be sources of resistance. Now we talk about resistance. Resistance is described by our adversary, Israel, as a form of terrorism. Now I want to submit to you that resistance is the total negation of terrorism. Resistance doesn't exclude civil disobedience, doesn't exclude nonviolence, doesn't exclude demonstrations, doesn't exclude hunger strikes, doesn't exclude all sorts of appeal to the conscience of the world. It does not exclude dropping when you exhaust all these options. It doesn't exclude armed resistance. That should never have been said. We drop it. You don't use it. You don't try to seek an opportunity to use it unless you have exhausted, through the culture of resistance, all the options available to you on the international scale, on the national scale. Now, I want to defend the Palestinian Authority. I want to defend it. I want to defend it because there is no Palestinian liberation unless there is an Arab United Front. This is an Arab national responsibility. We have surrounded the Palestinians with two states that have normalized their relationship with Israel. And therefore, they have cut and they have rendered the Palestinian struggle, both in Gaza and in the West Bank, whichever way, one gravitating towards being a condominium of the United States and Israel, and the other being a resistance movement exclusively wanting, without the culture and the strategic thinking that surrounds and dominates and determines the viability of resistance. This polarization between almost a satellitized entity and another entity which claims that it is making it costly for Israel, as exercising some attacks on Sderot and other places, because there is no strategy, because the Palestinian situation is surrounded by a siege of normalization between Israel and two of our Arab states. Do we undo this? Are we able to do it? Well, that's the question. My answer is that we ought to do it. There is this impunity of Israel has to be costly. You can't have an impunity entity like Israel without making it costly for its aggression, for its settlements and otherwise. In this respect, another narrative. President Obama, in a gesture of goodwill towards the Palestinians, have asked Israel to freeze settlements. I would answer, Mr. President, with due respect to your intentions, to your decency, to your humanity. freezing settlements have made it possible for Netanyahu to say, after 10 months, that he is willing to make, quote, painful concessions. Mr. Netanyahu, you don't concede what you concede what you own. You don't concede what you occupy. That has to be clarified. You don't concede what you own, what you occupy. You concede what you own. And therefore, the minute the Israeli policy making says that they are making concessions, not only concessions, they want to elicit the sympathy, painful concessions. Then Mr. Abbas, the president of the Palestinian Authority, then says that I will not resume unless they freeze for another month. And then the Arab League, my favorite anchor for 10 years in the United Nations, says very clearly, every time Mr. Abbas says we'll have to go and consult the committee, and the committee says, all right, for practical reasons and to satisfy our American friends and allies, go ahead, ask for a freeze. So we froze one time 10 months, second time 2 months, and now we're asking for 1 month to resume, quote, the fallacy of negotiations. Imagine the erosion of credibility, Amjad, of the peace process. This is a process which is predicated, they said, on the roadmap. Of course, it's a nice sentence, word, roadmap. Roadmap is a great word. But this is a road without a map. We have to discover the map so that we can go on the road of it. There is no map. And that is why Israel's impunity resides in the following. One, Gaza is an enemy territory. Two, the others are in varying degrees peculiar entities. It says it openly. It never admitted, most probably does not admit, that it is an occupying power. I want to be completely unrealistic in the present narrative and say these are conquered territories and therefore they should be resisted. Clear. We can no longer equivocate. But on the other hand, now here I come to my reactionary ideology of being an Arab nationalist. The impunity of Israel can be deterred by certain available measures, which in the foreseeable future will not take place. So in a way, at my age of 82, I am probably putting forward, at the moment, impossible options, but hopefully the new generation will entertain discussing them. And that is the Arab League, which is unfortunately the League of Arab Governments and not the League of Arab States, because the League of Arab States is the government and society, governments and people. The League of Arab Governments can undertake two things. Suspend, I'm not saying cut, I'm still a little bit realistic. Suspend relations between Egypt and Israel And two, reintroduce the boycott, economic boycott. These would be minor gestures which would re-involve the civil societies in the Arab world in pressurizing the governments, as my friend Sa'd Ibrahim has said, are completely divorced from what is called the Arab Street. Egypt, my friends, is crucial. Egypt, when you talk about Egypt and the vacuum that has been created by its peace treaty with Israel, has brought about Ahmadinejad and Erdogan, although there is difference between them, into our narrative. They brought it into our narrative because Egypt is the focal point of the Arab nation. It is the cross-fertilizer between the Islamic impulses that motivated Arab Africa to their national liberation, and it has motivated the so-called Middle East in its secular. It has bound together secularism and Islam, not as a contradiction in terms, but as a mutually reinforcing Arab nationalist movement. This has to be restored if the liberation of Palestine is to be achieved. That might be a vision for the next generation or two. But at the moment, at least, it is necessary to extricate the Palestinian people, and both Gaza and West Bank and East Jerusalem, from the suffocation of their insularity as a result of two neighbors cutting them off from the breathing space of innovation and resistance. Thank you very much.